When I finished reading, I noticed Leslie filling her glass again at the kitchen island. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I will," I replied. She nodded and returned with the bottle and her filled glass. She sat down next to me, filled my glass, and turned to me, looking at me with doe-like eyes. "What's up, Rick? What are we going to do?" I looked at Leslie, and she was without a doubt a very attractive woman. Leslie just oozed sex appeal from every pore. Everything about her screamed that she wanted to be fucked. But I was still trying to make sense of my wife flying to Colombia with Doctors Without Borders to fuck Dr. Trey Cardoza. In exchange, Marcy talked our neighbor Leslie Nielsen into having sex with me for the 6 weeks she would be gone. Leslie and her husband Vincent had a strange relationship. Vincent enjoyed watching his wife with other men. Their whole situation was completely ridiculous. Besides, at that moment I realized that I was in no position to make any rational decisions. I took a deep breath and shook my head. "We're not going to do anything." "Why?" asked Leslie with disappointment on her face. "Your wife gave you a pass for 6 weeks. Don't you find me attractive?" "I find you very attractive, Leslie. However, I have a lot to think about and a decision to make. Accepting my wife's proposal goes against everything my parents taught me, everything the army taught me, and the way I've lived my whole life. I need to decide what I'm going to do with my marriage." "Let me sleep." "Okay, Rick," Leslie said, pouting slightly. "Give me a call tomorrow. I really hope you take advantage of what your wife has offered you. I really want to be with you, and my husband thinks it would be good for both of us." I was glad that Leslie had left my house without a hassle. As tantalizing as the thought of sex with Leslie was, the lifestyle the Nielsens led repulsed me. They had convinced themselves that they had a unique and wonderful relationship. However, I would be surprised if their marriage lasts another 5 years. In all the shitstorm I was currently in, I was certain of only one thing: I was not going to accept my roommate's proposal, and I would leave her a message to that effect tomorrow. I grabbed a beer and sat down at my desk in our room. I needed to think and work out a plan of how to proceed. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my marriage. But one thing was certain: I would not let my wife's sexy trip to Colombia be what she envisioned. It would definitely not be the romantic trip she had planned. I finally put the pieces of my plan together. It wasn't perfect, but it seemed to accomplish what needed to be done. As an Army intelligence officer, I had made a lot of contacts and owed a lot of favors. Tonight I was going to utilize some of those contacts and favors. It took about an hour to make a list of things I wanted to accomplish. Then I picked up the phone and started making calls. Since Colombia was an hour behind me, I wasn't inconveniencing many people. I made another call, and it was to Deirdre. I had kept in touch with her over the years because of our closeness in the military. Marcy hinted that Deirdre had told her about our cheating together. This was unlike the soldier I had served with. Deirdre's phone rang 4 times before she picked it up. "Hello." "Hey, Deirdre, it's Rick. How are you?" "Rick," Deirdre said excitedly. "I'm doing great. How are you?" "Not so much right now," I replied. "I have a serious problem with Marcy." "Do you mind if I ask you about how you've been visiting her since you returned from overseas?" "Not at all," Deirdre replied. "Like I said, I came by to let her know you were safe and unhurt in that skirmish. Rumors of the ambush had spread, and I wanted her to know you were okay." "Deirdre," I said, catching my breath, "I want you to be straight with me. Marcy claims you made it sound like we slept together." "Rick, I would never do anything like that to you," Deirdre said eagerly. "But your wife wasn't happy to see me and made some remark about how close we are. I didn't want to upset her, so I just left." "That's more like you, Deirdre," I said good-naturedly. We talked for another 15 minutes before I let her go. The only thing I learned was that Deirdre had finally found the right mister and was getting married. When I finally finished talking to Deirdre, it was past midnight. I did the best I could and went to bed. I wished I'd gotten a good night's sleep, but it was impossible. I tossed and turned, trying to figure out why Marcy was doing this. But most importantly, I was trying to decide if my wife and I could overcome her cheating. Was I ready to break up a 24-year marriage? I think I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning, but the morning sun and my exhausted mind kept me awake until 6. So I got up, ate breakfast, and put on my sneakers. In the mornings, I often started the day with a 6 or 7 mile run. Today I had already run 7 miles before I realized I needed to wind down. Still, I managed to get a lot of quality work done. My mind was still racing as I jogged down our cul-de-sac. I was almost home when I saw Jacob Tanner sitting on the curb in front of his house, crying. It was the 9-year-old son of our neighbor, Kimberly Tanner. I slowed down and pulled in front of the boy. He didn't even notice me, and I realized something was bothering him a lot. Jacob and his mother Kimberly had lived on our street for the past 5 years after Kimberly's husband, David, had been killed in a car accident. David and Kimberly bought this house a week before he died. They sold their old house and closed the deal to buy a new one. Kimberly had no choice, she had to move. For several years she had a very difficult time keeping things together. At one time she worked 3 jobs to make ends meet. But eventually she took a job as an administrative assistant to an agent at Edward Jones. After that, Kimberly was no longer struggling financially. Marcy never liked Kimberly, and I could never understand why. The only thing I knew was that my wife thought Kimberly didn't look after her house the way everyone else in the neighborhood did. Marcy complained that Kimberly was driving down property values throughout the neighborhood. I tried to ask my wife to give Kimberly an indulgence because she was struggling financially. It didn't resonate and I didn't get involved. I know that Marcy and Kimberly had 2 or 3 conversations that I don't know about. But Marcy just didn't seem to like the single mom. I remembered one big argument in which Marcy called Kimberly a mean bitch. After that, the 2 women kept their distance from each other. However, Kimberly was always friendly to me. But to keep the peace, I kept my distance, too. Jacob still hadn't noticed me when I sat on the curb 10 feet away from him. I studied him for a minute. He was just a boy, and I often saw Jacob playing one sport or another with the other boys in the neighborhood. Plus he was a cute little kid with sandy-colored hair, freckles, and ears that stood out a little. "Hey Jacob, what's up?" I finally asked softly. Apparently the boy was startled when I spoke to him. He twitched slightly. Then Jacob looked at me with eyes so sad that a lump came up in my throat. "What's up, buddy?" I tried to get him to talk to me. "Is there anything I can do to help?" He shook his head. "No, my mom got a call from the athletic club and my baseball team is being disbanded because we don't have a coach." "What do you mean you don't have a coach?" "None of the parents could coach a team," Jacob said, wiping his nose with his sleeve. "And without a coach, we can't have a team. That means I can't play Little League." I thought about it for about 30 seconds. In all the years my kids had been growing up, I hadn't had the opportunity to train any of them, mostly because I didn't know when I'd be home. But now I was retired and working in civilian security, which allowed me to have a very flexible schedule. The idea of coaching a Little League team suddenly became very appealing to me. "Tell me, Jacob, are parents the only ones who can be coaches?" "No, because my friend Billy's team is coached by his uncle and my friend Paul's team is coached by his brother's friend." "Do you think they'll let me coach?" I asked. Jacob's eyes got big. "Would you really do that?" "Yes," I said with a wide smile, "if they'll let me." "Let's go ask your mom." Since it was still early, Kimberly was just getting ready for work when I knocked on their door. "Mr. Weston," Kimberly said affably. "To what do I owe your visit this morning?" "Jacob just told me that his baseball team is being disbanded because they don't have a coach. If that's acceptable, I'm willing to coach the team." I guess my request was hardly the last thing Kimberly expected me to want to talk to her about. As I watched her process my request, I studied Jacob's mother for perhaps the first time. The few times I'd found myself around Kimberly, Marcy had been somewhere nearby, so I hadn't looked too closely. Besides, the neighbor didn't interest me. Now I realized that Kimberly was very pretty, although a little overweight. But the extra pounds didn't make her any less attractive. I took a moment to study my roommate. Kimberly had medium-length dark brown hair and deep blue eyes. Her breasts were larger than Marcy's and a warm, friendly aura emanated from Kimberly. When I compared her to Marcy, it was like comparing apples to oranges. They were both beautiful, but in different ways. Marcy was only 5 feet 5 inches tall, with an athlete's build, slender and muscular. She had larger breasts than one would expect from someone of her build. But of course, I paid for them because that's what Marcy wanted, and I knew she wasn't sure about her small breasts. Kimberly had a more lush body, and she was taller, only a couple inches shorter than me. And I strongly suspected that Kimberly's breasts were real. One of the main differences I noticed between these two women was that Kimberly was very open and friendly with everyone. As the saying goes, she was exactly what you would imagine her to be. Marcy, on the other hand, while being a very loving wife most of the time, would get cold and bitchy from time to time. I justified those moments by saying it was my fault that she was away so often. Still, I loved her to bits until this latest incident. I don't see why not, Kimberly finally said, bringing me back to the present. However, I have to get to work and Jacob has to get to school. Let me give you Guy Patterson's number. He runs the baseball program. I think he's the one you should talk to. I talked to Guy and he put me in charge of coaching the Clifton Falcons. I learned that there were 8 teams in the league and they were all something like Clifton. They were the Owls, Cougars, Tigers, Bears, Eagles, Cobras, and Otters. I didn't understand the last one, but who cares? Our team colors were red and white, and practices were from 5 to 6:30 on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. I could have a third practice on Friday, too, because we were a week behind. Our first game was to be played on Saturday. Thus, we only had 1 week of practice. I actually walked to work that morning with a smile on my face. I had a lot more to look forward to than cheating on my wife. I slacked off a bit that morning, spending about an hour calling my parents to let them know who I was and when practice would be. That night when I got home from work, I got my first text from Columbia. It appeared that Marcy had gotten food poisoning. The people on the Doctors Without Borders team were somewhat alarmed and took her to the emergency room. There they kept her overnight for reassurance. She was then sentenced to bed rest for another day. That was my first stroke of retribution for cheating on my wife. Many more were to follow if she did not stop her affair. The next day I went straight from work to practice. All 12 of my players and at least one parent of each of them were waiting for me. I gave a very short speech about how I wanted to teach the kids the basics of baseball and sportsmanship. But mostly I wanted them to have fun. I asked the parents not to yell anything but cheers during the games. I spent that hour and a half with my young players, mostly assessing their abilities. We warmed up by throwing the ball around. Then we had infield practice, followed by batting practice. I alternated each kid at different positions, paying special attention to those in the pitcher's mound. I spent the last 25 minutes showing them how to properly receive the ball on the ground and catch the ball on the fly. I also explained to the kids the importance of putting the elbow farthest away from the pitcher and bringing the bat back so that the swing is quick and even. At the end of practice, I told my parents that we were working a little hard because we started so late. To boost team spirit, I asked them if they wanted to come over to my house on Sunday and have a cookout. I told them I would be cooking hamburgers and hot dogs and that I had a pool. All but one of the boys were able to come, and the ones who came said they would bring everything else. As I was heading to my car, Kimberly stopped me. "I just want to thank you for doing this," she said with sincere appreciation. "Your wife is very understanding. Even though we don't get along, please give her my thanks." "My wife is in Colombia right now, working for Medicine Sans Frontieres," I replied. "Well, thank you then," Kimberly said and started to walk away. She had only taken 4 steps when she stopped and looked back at me. "If your wife is away, that means you'll have to cook by yourself. Why don't you come over for dinner? We'll have spaghetti and meatballs." At first I was going to say no, but then I thought, why not? Fuck Marcy, I wasn't going to deny myself a home-cooked meal because she wanted to fuck some asshole doctor. "I have a few things to do at home first," I said with a bright smile. "Is it okay if I come over in an hour?" That would be perfect. When I returned home, I called my contacts in Colombia and was delighted to learn that the good Dr. Trey had gotten an irritant in his eyes. Apparently, something was blown in by the wind. Whatever the case, it caused the doctor a lot of pain and led to a trip to the emergency room. The swelling around his eyes worried the hospital staff and he was kept overnight. An almost invisible irritant hit the ventilator. And it just so happened that the ventilator was blowing on the doctor when he asked for the key. That was my first hit on the doctor. Dinner with Kimberly and Jacob was a real treat. Marcy was a good cook, but she preferred to eat out. So we had dinner 4 or 5 times a week. At dinner that night, I learned that Jacob was a little chatterbox. He talked nonstop about practices and upcoming games. I had already realized that Jacob was one of the best players on the team. Not only could he hit the ball hard, but he was definitely going to be one of my pitchers. The next day at work, I was informed that Dr. Trey had been released from the hospital, but his eyes were still swollen and sore. He was unable to go to the field that day. I also learned that Marcy had contracted a severe form of diarrhea. This puzzled the team because they were all on medication to keep from getting dysentery. But this wasn't dysentery. It was something invented in the lab, but it caused Marcy to be laid up for 3 days. So far, Marcy and the good doctor had only had 1 day of good fucking. The last few days have not been as much of a sexual fantasy as my wife thought. I mean, how can you be romantic when you're in over your head? Thursday's practice was a repeat of what we did on Tuesday. I was setting up where I thought the kids would do best in the lineup and on the field. Again, after practice, Kimberly invited me over for dinner. I, of course, said yes. She served shepherd's pie, which turned out to be excellent. After dinner, I stayed and helped Jacob with his homework. When he was done, his mom sent him to bed. Then Kimberly asked if I wanted a cup of coffee, and I gratefully agreed. "So, how are you handling Marcy's departure?" asked Kimberly. I don't know why it hit me so hard, but it did. I couldn't help but let out a sad sigh, and Kimberly caught it right away. "Rick, what's wrong?" "I don't want to burden you with my problems," I said, trying to distract myself. "It's just that Marcy and I aren't in a good place right now. I realize it's none of my business, but if you want to talk about it, I'm a good listener." I looked at Kimberly's warm smile and said to myself, so what? I needed someone to talk to, and I still didn't want to burden the kids. So I briefly told my neighbor about what was going on with my marriage. I talked about how my wife insisted that she was entitled to the affair because she was convinced of my indiscretion. I also explained that Marcy had arranged for me to meet Leslie Nielsen. It surprised me that Kimberly knew all about the Nielsen's lifestyle, which was why she stayed away from them. Finally, I read the letter that Marcy had left me, which I now carried in my pocket to reread whenever I wanted. When I finished, Kimberly's face went from concern to sad. "Rick," she said finally, "maybe I'm overreacting, but I think your wife is a selfish bitch. She jeopardized a 24-year marriage to have 6 weeks in the hay with some doctor. What a stupid cow." I grinned. "No, you haven't overreacted to anything. I've been thinking along those lines ever since I found out. I'm actually struggling with the fact that Marcy admitted she didn't know if I was cheating, but she's convinced herself she's still entitled to the affair." "Rick, do you know why Marcy and I don't get along?" said Kimberly after a brief pause in our conversation. "No, not really," I admitted. "One day I saw you cutting the grass and you weren't wearing a shirt. I made the mistake of telling Marcy that I thought she was lucky to have such a sexy husband. She took offense and started accusing me of wanting to steal you away. So she's being very hypocritical. You didn't tell Marcy about me, did you?" My face flushed. I complimented her, but she didn't take it. Kimberly sat there for a minute, smirking at my discomfort, but then continued. "In her letter, Marcy said that if you love someone, set them free. And let them come back to you. Well, she's completely wrong. If you love someone, you don't set them free by cheating on them. My husband cheated on me, and that's why we bought this house. He had a very brief affair with his secretary. After a rough time, we decided to make a fresh start. David changed jobs and we started working on rebuilding our marriage. And we were doing well when David was killed in a car accident. Some days I still miss him very much, even after 5 years. We talked some more, and then I went home. For the first time since I'd learned of Marcy's intentions, I slept soundly. Friday afternoon was another practice, and I had pretty much decided who was going to play where. We had 6 pretty good players, 3 SOSO players, and 3 that needed a lot of work. At practice that day I met Guy for the first time. He was a tall thin man with bright red hair and an infectious laugh. He also had 3 boys in 3 different age groups. He gave me the uniforms for the kids and told me that the league required each kid to play at least 3 innings of every 6-inning game. The kids came over all excited when I handed out the uniforms to them. I loved the hell out of coaching. My joyful mood as I drove home suddenly soured when I remembered something from the past. The year I was at a station close to home, I told Marcy T. Had I was thinking of coaching Kyle's team. She went ballistic because she had a long list of things she wanted us to do. Most of them were things she couldn't easily do herself. I gave in to her demands because I felt guilty about all the time I had spent away from home. Now I resented Marcy for depriving me of the opportunity to spend time with my son. Saturday's game was almost a rout. We were defeated 11-3. I was constantly encouraging the players throughout the game and I was pleased that most of the parents did the same. At the same time, I was pointing out points that I felt we could improve on. Jacob had a great game with a double and a triple. His hitting provided 2 of our 3 wins. He also made great plays at shortstop and in center field. At the end of the game, the kids were a little depressed, but when I told them we were going out for ice cream, all thoughts of losing evaporated. Some of the parents tried to give me money, but I just laughed, telling them I had to pay them for all the fun I was having. The potlucks at my house were a real team-building activity. Some parents brought salad, beans, or fruit and others brought desserts. I cooked a bunch of hamburgers and hot dogs while the kids swam and played games. I also had plenty of beer, sodas, and water. Kimberly came in a 2-piece swimsuit and looked really good. Toward the end, I gathered the kids and told them that before each game and after each game we would do an anthem. It would just be Falcons. 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 When I asked the kids to do it, they roared it out to the laughter and cheers of their parents. In the evening, I learned that Marie's face and hands were covered in hives. Apparently it was related to her peanut allergy. I was informed that the face cream Marcy had used that evening contained peanut oil. Marcy claimed to have used this cream for years with no ill effects. However, when they looked at the ingredients on the newly opened jar, it definitely said peanut butter. Since Marcy had bought a new jar specifically for this trip, it turned out that she had just mixed it up at the store. Marcy wasn't wrong, the jar of cream had been switched. Since Kimberly had found out about my wife's infidelity, she made an open invitation to join them for dinner whenever I wanted. I wasn't much of a cook, so I accepted her offer if she would let me pay for some of the groceries. She laughingly agreed, and after that we started going grocery shopping once a week. I really enjoyed spending time with Kimberly and Jacob. I had not contacted Marcy since that phone conversation and had no intention of doing so. Nor had Marcy made any attempt to contact me. I was now 90% sure I was going to divorce her. That 10% evaporated 2 days later when I received a video of Dr. Trey and my wife fucking. Her hives were finally starting to fade. Marcy wasn't exactly healthy, but she was curled up on the bed while the good doctor chiseled her from behind. He seemed to be enjoying himself, but Marcy still seemed to be in pain. After I made the decision to divorce Marcy, I discussed it with Kimberly. I began to take her advice often. Kimberly advised me to make sure I was financially secure. Since I had always trusted Marcy unconditionally, this had never occurred to me. I began to realize that I would miss both Kimberly and Jacob when the season was over, but I pushed the thought out of my mind. There were still 7 games left, and I intended to savor every one of them. I wasn't sure how things would turn out when Marie got back, but I didn't care what she thought anymore. That Friday, 4 things happened. First, I was informed that Marcy had some kind of vaginal infection. She didn't realize that Marcy's spritzing fluid had been contaminated with an irritant and bacteria. It would take about 2 weeks for the effects to wear off. The second was the report that Dr. Trey would become severely ill with dysentery as soon as Marcy recovered. Again, the medics would be surprised as they thought everyone was protected by their medications. Besides, Dr. Cardoza should have had a natural immunity, as he had been to Colombia several times before. However, he was not immune to the special bacteria I had acquired in India. Within 3 or 4 days he was to pass from both sides. The third thing that happened was my visit to a divorce attorney. It would be a simple divorce with one possible problem: the house. I knew Marcy would want it. After all, she had picked it out and decorated it herself. I wanted it so I could stay close to Kimberly and Jacob. That was just one of the things Marcy and I had to discuss. My lawyer warned me that Marcy might try to claim a portion of my army pension. The fourth thing that happened that day was the beginning of my separation from Marcy. I started by separating our finances. I took half of everything out of our accounts and opened new ones in my name only. Marcy and I had our own credit cards and I left them alone. Then I moved all of Marcy's things from the master bedroom to the guest room. As far as I was concerned, I wasn't moving because Marcy was the one who screwed up. And finally, I removed everything that belonged to Marcy from the rest of the house. I even removed all the pictures that had Marcy in them. That Saturday, the Falcons beat the Bears by a score of 5-4. Jacob hit a home run and struck out the last 2 players on a free pass. After they shook hands, my team screamed. Kimberly even gave me a hug and a kiss on the cheek. It was wonderful. And the excitement carried over to the ice cream parlor. By premeditated plan, my dirty tricks were put on hold. Given the medical problems Dr. Trey and my wife were having, if they were having sex, it couldn't be much fun. However, dinners with Kimberly and Jacob were becoming the highlight of my day. Jacob and I had really bonded. He wanted and needed a father figure, and I was more than happy to provide one. My only concern was what would happen when the season was over. The next 3 weeks went by very quickly. We won 2 games and lost 1. Regardless of the score, a trip to the ice cream store followed. Kimberly always slipped into the booth next to me. What's more, she would slip right in until we were touching. At first, my parents regarded this with disbelief. So I met the problem face to face. I told a few moms about what was going on in my marriage and that I was in the process of divorce. Soon the story reached all the parents and their reactions surprised me. Not only did they understand, but they became protective of me and went out of their way to be nice to Kimberly. In the 6th week after my wife left, she had to endure a few more humiliations. One day she and her lover decided to go on a picnic. Somehow they were attacked by killer bees. The authorities told them they were lucky it was such a small hive. Nevertheless, they each received at least a dozen very painful stings that left huge welts. This necessitated another overnight stay in the hospital. Then there was the night they discovered scorpions and spiders in their room. Marcy insisted they go to her room where they discovered a snake. The 3rd room smelled like vomit and the 4th room was fine until the police burst in there looking for drugs. Needless to say, they got very little sleep that night. With 10 days to go, my wife mysteriously contracted a yeast infection. For days before they were due back, the good doctor was hit by a car. He suffered a broken ankle and a fractured right hand and wrist. He also suffered a concussion and a severe abrasion on the left side of his face. My wife's affair ended with a bang, but not the one she envisioned. Oh yes, my wife was now suffering from another bout of rabies. Marcy was due back Sunday afternoon, so I figured I'd pick her up at the airport. To hell with her and her room at the Ambassador Hotel. But before getting into trouble, we still had a game to play that Saturday. We were playing the Otters. I never knew what they were called, but I knew they were undefeated. The Otters led 6-1 in the 3rd inning, but we continued to cut into their lead until the bottom of the 6th when we tied the game 6-6. We went 2 scoreless extra innings, but the Otters scored a run in the top of the 9th. We had 2 men on with 2 outs when Jacob got into scoring position. He already had 3 hits on the day, one of which was a home run. With the count at 3-2, Jacob swung and missed. We lost the game. I could see Jacob's lips start to quiver and tears streaming down his face. So I rushed over to him and took him in my arms. "Hey, buddy," I said, waving him over. "I'm so proud of you." "But I knocked the ball out," he almost sobbed. "So what?" I said with a laugh. By then, the rest of the team had gathered around me, and I told my players to line up. We shook hands and the coach pulled me aside to tell me that we were the toughest team they had faced. I thanked him and gathered my demoralized team in front of the dugout. I'd never seen them so depressed, and Jacob was on the verge of tears. I decided it was time to teach them one of life's lessons. "Who thinks we failed today?" I asked. All hands went up. "You shouldn't," I said calmly. "In life, you're going to win sometimes and lose sometimes. Hopefully, you'll win many more times than you lose. But you must learn to accept each defeat with dignity and learn from it. Right now, I'm proud of each and every one of you. You all played the best you could." "How can you play better than you are?" asked Timmy, looking at me. "It's really quite simple," I explained. "If you only play to your best, how can you get better?" I saw not only my players nodding their heads, but their parents as well. In my opinion, this team was a little better than we were today. But if we play them again, we're going to kick their asses. So, who wants to cheer us on? Players, parents, and I call. Tively yelled, "Falcons! Falcons! Falcons!" When our cheering subsided, I turned to them, "Who wants to eat ice cream?" The disappointment they felt quickly faded away. As I gathered our gear, Kimberly came into the dugout with me. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. "What's the matter?" I asked, deeply concerned. "Nothing," she said, pulling herself closer to me. "You're the most wonderful man I know." Then she kissed me on the lips. I was a little slow, but within a second I was kissing her back. Everything changed for Kimberly and I after that kiss in the dugout. I quickly realized that our relationship had taken a huge step forward. I suddenly realized that I was falling in love with her. At the ice cream parlor, I couldn't stop wishing that Marcy would stay in Colombia forever. However, Marcy's flight arrived at 2:45 the next day. It was almost 3:30 when the passengers went through customs. I saw Dr. Trey being wheeled out in a wheelchair, with Marcy walking beside him. She looked terrible. It was obvious that she had lost at least 10 pounds, and it was evident in her figure. Her skin had a pasty color, and some of the scars from bee stings had not yet fully healed. When Marcy saw me, I couldn't read the expression on her face. She just said something to the doctor and walked over to where I was standing. "I thought you were going to meet me at the Ambassador Hotel?" she asked. "No, that was your plan, not mine," I replied calmly. "That's just as well, because I don't feel well." While Marcy and I waited for her 2 suitcases, we said nothing to each other. When we got into the car, the ride home was also in silence. After throwing 1 or 2 glances at Marcy, I finally realized the look on her face. It was fear. When I took Marcy's bags to the guest room, war broke out. "Why are you putting my bags in the guest room?" she snapped back. "Because we don't sleep together anymore," I said without emotion. "Once you get a chance to settle in, we need to talk." "Damn it, we need to talk," Marcy snapped again. "I'm not going to sleep in the guest room. If you don't want to sleep with me, then sleep there." As much as I wanted to stay calm, Marcy's last comment made me angry. I was sick of her attitude and lashed out at her. "Go to hell, Marcy. I'm not the one who messed up our relationship. If you don't like it, go sleep with your fucking Dr. Trey. In all our marriage, I've never been so angry with my wife." Marcy saw the hatred in my eyes and fled into the guest room. She slammed the door shut and locked it. I felt ashamed of my behavior and went to apologize. But when I got to the door, I heard her sobbing. I decided to let her cool down. I was sitting in the kitchen sipping coffee when Marcy finally came down about an hour later. She took a cup and filled it with coffee, then sat down at the kitchen table across from me. I held the envelope out to Marcy across the table. "What is it?" she asked with fear in her eyes. "What you said you were willing to accept is divorce papers." "I don't want a divorce," Marcy said in a thin voice. "Here's what you wrote," I said, pulling out her letter. "If you and I still love each other, it will all go away when I see you when I return. If not, I'll be hurt, and I'll mourn what you and I have had and lost. But I can't imagine being married and not doing it." Tears streamed down Marcy's face as I finished reading her words. "This is where you begin to mourn what you and I have had and lost." "What about you and Leslie?" demanded Marcy. "I'm sure you shook the brains out of her." "I never touched that fucking whore," I growled in genuine anger. "And who are you to try to bribe me?" Marcy stepped back in uncertainty. I think she was in complete denial about what she had done and what the consequences would be. I was sure that Marcy thought it would be okay if I fucked Leslie and she fucked Trey. Since it was almost 6 and I needed to get away from Marcy, I got up and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Marcy immediately challenged. "I have an invitation to have dinner at Kimberly's house." "Oh, you won't fuck Leslie, but you will fuck that cow across the street," Marcy spat out. "I knew that bitch had a crush on you." I had to take a deep breath and count to 10 because I wanted to beat the shit out of my wife. But, pulling myself together, I decided to be brutally honest. "For your information, the cow is you, not Kimberly," I said through clenched teeth. "You're the one who can't keep her legs together, not Kimberly. And while it's none of your fucking business, I didn't sleep with Kimberly. However, I can't think of anything that would make me happier than making love to her." I was breathing hard after that outburst, but I wasn't done yet. "You know, Marcy, for a while after you left, I thought that if I let you fuck Trey that first night and then ruined your holiday, you'd come to your senses. By your calculations, we should have been even at that point. If you had broken up with Trey then, I would have been ready to move on and fix our marriage. But you never gave it a second thought. And when I saw the video of the good doctor beating you from behind, I lost all respect and love for you. At that moment, I considered you nothing more than a cheating whore." "Have you been spying on me?" shouted Marcy. "Not only have I been spying on you, but I've been making sure that you and Dr. Fool have a miserable time. As far as I can tell, you only fucked for 2 or 3 days. And with the exception of the first night, I doubt those sexual encounters were all that pleasurable. The rest of the time, one or the other or both of you were miserable. And I have enjoyed every bit of your misery." "You goddamn bastard," screamed Marcy. "I'm going to hold you accountable and then sue you." I laughed, and Marcy got even angrier. "I'm going to make you pay." She yelled even louder. "Marcy, for a smart woman, you really can be stupid when you want to be," I said when I stopped laughing. "Let's start with the fact that it happened in another country. So you or the stupid doctor would have to arrest me in Colombia. And I'm not going there anytime soon. But even if I were, you have absolutely no proof. So get over it, I've ruined your little sexual fantasy, and I'm very happy about it." My laughter became harsh as I sprinted out the door, and I was still worked up when I got to Kimberly's house. As soon as she opened the door, Kimberly realized I was upset. But after a beer, I calmed down and explained what had happened. Apparently, I wasn't as calm as I thought I was. I retold Kimberly everything I had said. When I finished, the fires of arousal flickered in Kimberly's eyes, and she giggled. "Did you really tell her that there was nothing that could make you happier than making love to me?" I blushed brightly as I realized what I had just admitted to. Then I started to giggle. "That's probably the only thing I'm 100% sure of right now." "Well, that thought hasn't left me since the first week you started coaching Jacob's team." Kimberly's cheeks flamed red, but her eyes sparkled. "And after Jacob goes to bed, I want you to come to bed with me so we can make each other very happy." I sighed and shook my head. "I'm sorry, Kimberly," I whimpered, "but I can't do this while I'm still married. And regardless of the fact that my wife broke our marriage vows, I just can't do it. Will you forgive me if I take the rain check at least until Marcy signs the divorce papers?" "To have you in my life," Kimberly said with pure love in her eyes, "I'll wait until hell freezes over." Marcy seemed determined to keep me as her husband. She fought the divorce to the bitter end. She even instructed her attorney to encroach on my army pension. My attorney advised me to offer her the house in exchange for her leaving my pension alone. Marcy, however, refused the offer. She still believed that we could repair our marriage once I got over my resentments. I had to somehow convince my wife that there was no way we could ever get back together. Marcy and I hadn't had sex since her return, and I wondered if she was having it with Dr. Cardoza. I hooked up phones and set up cameras in the house when Marcy wasn't home. If I found out Marcy was fucking that creep in our house, I would definitely go after Dr. Trey. I didn't immediately catch the phone conversation between my wife and Trey. Marcy, honey, when are we going to get together? We haven't done anything together since we got back. Maybe next Wednesday, Marcy replied after a long pause. I know Rick has to go out of town for the day. I'll have to think about it. I still don't understand why you won't just agree to a divorce. Will you marry me if he does? Hell no, the doctor grinned. I just like fucking your brains out. You're just an amazing fucker. The feelings are the same. You're fun to fuck, but as a husband you're shit. Rick is a great husband and I still love him. To tell you the truth, Trey, I wish I'd never gotten involved with you. Rick is twice the man you are, but now he won't even touch me. So if he doesn't want to have sex with me, I'll have to look elsewhere. I'll let you know. Armed with this new information, my attorney and I set up a meeting with Marcy's attorney and herself. It was a rather brief meeting that ended when I replayed the conversation with the good doctor. At that point, Marcy was still begging me to reconcile. She was still claiming that I had cheated on Deirdre and she had cheated on Trey. We should put all of that behind us and start fresh. I decided to finally tell her about me and Deirdre. I told her that what Deirdre and I had done had happened in Afghanistan. We were on a reconnaissance mission in one of the northern provinces, where we were supposed to meet a spy we had infiltrated into the Taliban. What we did not know, however, was that he had been uncov. Read and killed. However, before he died, he told them when and where we were going to meet. The Taliban ambushed us, but it was a clumsy attempt and I spotted it before we were too deep. Nevertheless, we had to fight and only got out when air support came to our aid. 2 of those with us were killed and 2 others were wounded. If we had given ourselves completely, we would have all been killed. Deirdre and I were just shocked when we realized how close we had come to being killed. There's no way to explain to a person what it's like to be in that situation. I still have nightmares about that mission sometimes. Anyway, when we got back to base camp, Deirdre was a mess. When I brought her to her quarters, she was crying uncontrollably. I hugged her and tried to calm her down. Deirdre then kissed me, and I kissed her back. At this point, I let my guard down. We performed oral sex on each other. However, when Deirdre tried to pull me into her bunk, I came to my senses and stopped. I just couldn't do that to my wife. But it couldn't be helped, I had cheated, and the guilt never left me. When I finished the story, I saw Marcy fidget in her chair. The excuse she had built in her head had just collapsed. Nevertheless, Marcy was unwilling to relent. However, she brought another twist to the case. Her attorney filed a petition with the court and the judge scheduled counseling. I went, but after a few sessions, it became clear to the counselor that the marriage was over. Marcy then signed the papers and agreed to the house in exchange for leaving my pension alone. During all of this, the baseball season continued. We won the last 2 games of the regular season. Then the league had a playoff system in which the first-place team played the 8th-place team, and the second-place team played the 7th-place team, and so on. We won our first 2 playoff games, which put us in the finals against the Otters. I finally found out why the team was named the Otters. It was because Gus' son loved the Otters, and he was on that team. Anyway, this final game was much different than our first meeting. We won by a score of 8-3. I took Jacob out of center field to pitch when the Otters started to rally in the bottom of the 4th period. They had already scored 3 goals, but no one was coming out. Jacob stopped them, allowing the Otters only 1 hit the rest of the game. They never got any further than first base. This victory was bittersweet for me. I was thrilled that our guys had won the championship, but I was sad that it was my last game. That Sunday we had an end-of-season party at my house. I told Marcy she could join us, but she preferred to stay in her room. I bought 12 official Little League baseballs and gave one to each of my players. Then I gave them pens and told them to put their signature on each ball. It was funny to watch them try to fit all the signatures on the balls. But somehow they managed to do it. My parents then gave me a framed 12 by 24-inch photo of our team that each player signed. At the end of the party, however, I was even more depressed because the season was completely over. During the party, I had to tell Kimberly that I was moving because Marcy was getting the house. I could see the fear in her eyes, and it made me feel even worse. I couldn't imagine how I was going to explain to Jacob that I wasn't going to live in this neighborhood anymore. However, what happened that evening and that night lifted my spirits all the way to the top. First of all, around 7 o'clock that evening, I got a call from Gus asking if I would be the coach next season. It went like this: the coaches would get together before the season and put together a new team. The coach could keep his son on the team, or, as in my case, I would be allowed to keep Jacob. But the rest of the teams were made up of the players the coaches recruited. It took me a millisecond to tell him I agreed. Later that evening, Kimberly informed me that if I was going to move anywhere, it would be to her house and nowhere else. Since Marcy had signed the divorce papers the night before, she wanted me to sleep with her that night. Let me just say that it was hard for me to wait for Jacob to go to bed, because I wanted Kimberly so badly. When I realized I would have to move, I didn't want to risk losing Kimberly, so I intended to ask her to marry me. I thought it was the perfect time to propose. Of course she said yes and showered me with kisses. She then dragged me to bed where we made love for several hours before falling asleep in each other's arms. Waking up to Kimberly snuggled next to me in bed was truly wonderful. I was a little nervous when Kimberly decided to tell Jacob the next day that we were getting married. He kept asking when I was going to be his daddy. All I could tell him was soon. I didn't think his grin could get any wider, but it did. Epilogue. It's funny how one of the worst periods of my life has turned into a whole new chapter that has made me happier than I could have imagined. Sure, Kimberly and I have our arguments, but we work them out, and makeup sex is great. After getting approval from his mother and my children, I asked Jacob if he wanted me to adopt him. He was so excited about the idea that he asked me every few days when I would become his official father. I, on the other hand, pestered the lawyers every day to get the paperwork done. Jacob is as loving a son as one could ever hope for. And I'm thrilled that my children have not only accepted Kimberly as my new wife, but think the world of Jacob. And Jacob adores Kyle, wanting to play ball with him every time he comes to visit. Jacob is the little brother Kyle has always wanted. I know Marcy wasn't too happy about the adoption because she made comments to our two kids. But I could care less what she thinks. Kimberly and I had talked about having a child together, but I wasn't enthusiastic about it. At 49, I was 11 years older than Kimberly. I noted that I would be 65 when our child turned 15. It didn't seem fair to the child, to Kimberly, or to me. And yet I know that if I had agreed, Kimberly would have immediately begun the process of having a child with eagerness. There are times when that thought flashes through my head and I wonder if maybe I should have done it. Of course, that thought only lasts a few seconds, and then reality returns. As I predicted, the Nielsen's divorced about 3.5 years after this incident. It seems Leslie had fallen in love with one of her husband's chosen mistresses. However, 6 months later I learned that she had left her new lover for another. It seems Leslie just likes having different men. I ran into Leslie at the store once, and it was very awkward. Well, how can you talk about the weather with a woman who offered to fuck your brains out? She told me that Vincent had remarried and was no longer sharing with us. However, Leslie didn't fail to inform me that she still considered the deal with Marcy to be on the table. I politely declined. Marcy still lives across the street and we kind of get along. It wasn't like that at first, because she was very angry that I divorced her. Marcy even told our kids that the divorce was my fault. This made me angry because it caused animosity between me and the kids. It stopped when I sent each of them a copy of the letter their mother had left me. Then there was a period when the kids and Marcy were at odds. Things are pretty peaceful now. The holidays started out as a problem. Marcy insisted that the kids come to visit her for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Kimberly and I invited them to stay with us, and we even invited Marcy. For the first couple years, my kids split the days between both houses. However, by the third year, they got tired of it. They told my mom to put on pants and accept the invitation to Kimberly's house, and then we could all spend the holidays together. From time to time I noticed Marcy's dates as they came to pick her up or came back to spend the night. Dr. Trey was a frequent visitor for a short period of time until he was caught having a sordid relationship with the hospital administrator's wife and was fired. Yes, I was the one who made the administrator aware of the doctor's activities. I don't know where he went or what he's doing now, nor do I care. He was a scumbag who deserved much worse. Marcy had a steady stream of suitors. I never knew which one was which, and I wasn't interested. About 3 months ago, I found out that Marcy was engaged. To a doctor, of course. I had met him a few times and he seemed like a nice guy. I'm not sure if Marcy really loves this guy or not. I hope she treats him better than she treats me. We still have gatherings at our cul-de-sac, and Marcy usually comes with her fiancé. But I often notice that her eyes are fixed on me, and there's a sadness in them. I can't help but wonder if Marcy regrets telling me about her decision to have an affair that one time.